And so it was like, okay, thank you. You know, he did his robot blink, you know, smile, nod, right? And then the very next senator was saying, can you tell me everything Facebook does with the data that you collect? And so everyone's like, no. It's like, well, don't you think the terms of service should list everything that you could do with the data? Right, which is like, if you were to try to list that today, it would be 100 pages, and tomorrow it would be 102 pages, right? I mean, all the things that you can do with that data, that is endless. When you talk about the processing and the correlation and all of these things, right? They have a whole group at Facebook, their data science group. That's all they do. I love that group. I mean, one time I got to visit Facebook, like the campus, I was meeting with lawyers and stuff. The only picture I took was a selfie with the data science guy. That's how much I love these people, right? They get to dive into all this data. It's fascinating. But like, if you were to try to list all of that, it'd be way longer than 2.5 pages. So which is it? Which do you want? Do you want a list of everything Facebook can do? Or do you want to make it something that people will actually read before they use Facebook? Because those two goals, just by themselves, are completely exclusive.
And I will argue that neither of them will actually solve any privacy problems. Because people aren't going to read the short form, they're definitely not going to read the long form, and all you have with the long form is a Jeopardy document to catch companies.
And this goes back to the sort of the consumer, the tort protection idea, right? The idea. So, you know, you can. It's obvious if you have a high ledge. I'm thinking of this one place above New York City that has sort of this high ledge, and then there's like tracks down at the bottom, like way down, like, you know, 100 feet or whatever. And it's kind of tempting, I guess, if you're like a stupid teenager, it'd be like kind of cool to walk along this ledge around the upside of the track, right? Great view of Manhattan, all that kind of stuff. But it's like, but that's really stupid, right? So what are they going to do? They're going to put up a fence. Like I say, don't do this. Like, you can't do this. Do not pass, right? We don't leave it up to them, like, you know, because somebody will do it, right? So there are certainly situations where, you know, where you have to put up some sort of a block, I think, for people to protect them from themselves, and especially in the, you know, the Internet of Things context where there's no way in hell that people are going to directly regulate. You know, one thing in the GDPR, there's this transparency is one of the principles, and so, and they, you know, and it was raised. I think it's even in the recitals, the idea of like, well, that's going to be, you know, we understand it's going to be difficult to do you know, transparency for, you know, certain situations where you may not be the you know, directly in contact with the user or whatever, but they're like, but you can figure it out. Like, you know, like, you're smart. Like, so I mean, that's basically the message. Like, these are smart people. I mean, the people that design this app, Waze, you know, think about Waze is a very smart app, right? It knows where I am, how fast I'm going. It's got ways to collect information from lots of people, make predictions. It's got algorithms around, you know, sort of GPS of the whole world. You can figure out how to give me a notice that I want to know, or what I might want to know. Like, hey, Bart, did you know that the last 3 websites you visited shared your data 1,000 times? Or, you know, in the IoT context, did you know you just passed 6 cameras that took pictures of you and shared them with, you know, this marketing provider, right?
Here they are. We can tell you need a haircut.
Yeah,
why don't you stop off at Supercuts? $2 off.
Exactly. After I get that message, I can get, like, you know, you could have sort of a virtual privacy assistant. You could have all kinds of things you could imagine, or others. You know, they call them PETs, or privacy enhancing technologies. But there are things that could be in place to protect privacy. But I think that you know, it's going to have to be pushed, right? It's not going to be it'll have to be because either consumers demand it, or the law demands it in some respect, or that, you know, that for some reason you get stuff pushed down to you, and that's kind of what we've seen, like in the industrial control systems, and there's sort of become the industrial Internet of Things, right? Where you have these, at least for the grid. Anybody that touches the grid now has, you know, specific cybersecurity controls, and I guarantee you that it's going to impact your IoT network, and then that's going to get pushed down to people that are using. I mean, you can imagine, you know, sort of wind turbines, or, you know, any number of things that could be attached as part of what supports the grid. Is going to get sort of, you know, pushed down and highly regulated, and people are going to look at that, and when something goes wrong, or another, Huawei, you know, they pulled the phones, the government's ability to regulate using the phones, and then there was this legislation passed the other day, was, you know what, we should take out all the all the devices, the controllers in the turbines, right? Like the Huawei, they weren't turbines, it was solar devices. In the solar devices, and you're sort of thinking like, oh, well, that kind of sucks. Like if I've got a solar farm, like I might have to take out all my Huawei, like invectors or whatever they call them,
Microcontrollers.
that like, you know, the control the panels, right? And it's a big, and that would really suck. It would cost a lot of money, it would be probably kind of complicated. On the other hand, if in fact the Chinese government can shut down my solar array, that would suck too, right? Like, so you know, like so these are kind of, you know, the implications are real, and you know, it's definitely something to think about.
I think one last question from me, and then we'll open up to the audience for questions. You had mentioned privacy-enhancing technologies, which made me think of privacy by design. So what role do you think privacy by design should have in the Internet of Things, which is just incorporating privacy at each step of the manufacturing and creation process?
So, you know, I track people for high net worth individuals for tax purposes. And I've built the systems as cryptographically private because I want to be protected from myself. Because, you know, the bottom line is, if any one of my clients ever thought that I was tracking them, they would jump so many lawyers on me that I would be a smear on the road and I'm done. So I'm using cryptography to protect myself from my own clients, right? Because I've designed it to be private from the beginning. But that's an extremely, very, very small niche. And very few people are willing to pay both the engineering cost, the engineering trouble, like I've got a durable bug for 3 months that I can't debug because the system is so locked down from itself. That is really quite difficult to fix. So when you go the privacy maximalization path, life gets really difficult pretty quickly. So most people don't want to go there. Most people aren't willing to pay for it. So I really am very pessimistic about any of our systems actually ever being private. Even our medical systems. Medical systems with HIPAA and all of that sort of stuff. It's either, we're figuring out now that HIPAA is getting in the way of good health care, so we're actually going to start breaking HIPAA almost certainly, because it's getting in the way of our ability to mine data to actually find trends to save lives. So we're about to break HIPAA almost certainly from the needs of big data people to find cures. Privacy is in the way of success in a lot of areas, and so I'm personally pessimistic about privacy-enhancing technologies and privacy-oriented systems, and I'm a practitioner. I like private systems. You know, if you pick up Spot Marks the Tax, it's cryptographically private. It's all about protecting everything, right? You know, I'm protected from bars subpoenas. He can come give me a subpoena. I'll give him the data. It's how rude. Send me a subpoena. No, I'll just give you the data because I can't do anything with it, and neither can you. You're going to have to make laws to force me to be able to read it because I designed it such that I can't even read it. Okay, and so that's how cryptographically private I am. Yet I can make legal law. I can make legal facts out of that data because of cryptography also. So I've built this very secure system for a very small amount of people, and I don't think most people want that. So I don't believe you're going to see a lot of privacy technologies.
You know, it sounds just so pessimistic what I'm saying, because I'm not that. But, you know, it really does come down to money being such a driving factor in the US, because privacy by design came in the FTC report like, hey, this is something you should consider. And companies saying, great, what's that? And they said, you know, it's where you design privacy. Like, there's not a guidance as to what that means, except for the thought that you think about it when you're designing a product as opposed to after you're done. It still doesn't answer the question of what you do, what's the base standards. I mean, a great example of this is the do not track button on browsers, right? Like, there is a button in your browser that allows third parties to track your information as you go from site to site. It's why you go on Amazon and look at one thing, and then you go on Facebook and see 5 ads for it, right? Because your do not track is not selected. When it came down to having this feature, and as the browser companies are talking and the internet advertisers are talking about having this feature, allowing it to track, it came down to, okay, we all agree there should be this button, do not track. Now, does that button start by being selected and customers have to uncheck it? Or does it start by being unchecked and customers have to check it? Like, is it off or on, right? And Google, of course, makes most of its money through advertising, despite having their fingers in everything, right? But they want to track. They want to be able to sell, the more granular the information, the more valuable it is to advertisers. So they want that do not track off by default. Microsoft, who they care less about the privacy, except that they don't want to give the money to Google, they want it on by default because they don't want Google getting all that valuable information. So here they want Internet Explorer to have do not track. They're saying, yes, we care about privacy. Oh, you just care about not giving Google money. And Google saying, no, we want it on because consumers care. No, you want it because you care. But those are the driving forces. Like, those are the very two views that, from the consumer perspective, is a fight over our privacy. And from the corporate perspective, is just a fight over money, right? And who gets the money in the first place. Unless we had something that said, these are your fundamental rights online. Like, you have the right to see what information is being collected, and if it's just staying at that site or going somewhere else. Something almost as simple as that you could then demand to see through transparency, demand them to delete, which California also requires. Without those fundamental rights, it's just going to be buried under, you go to 10 sites, well, they treat it 10 different ways. And we'll never have a consistent view of it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Well, one thing, I think if you don't do security, I'm going to call it security by design for a second. If you don't do security by design with respect to Internet of Things, which I think it's a thing, security by design. The privacy by design is certainly there. It's in the GDPR. It's been around. It's Kevokian's thing from she had bumper stickers and like it was like a trademark thing for her. But the idea came. It was a very, very good idea and an excellent idea in terms that you should make privacy in for the full life cycle all the way through. There's a case I was talking about with my class today, actually, the Google Buzz. I pulled up in I was thinking it was fairly recent, but it actually wasn't recent yet either. They were probably all had to. It was 2010. So Google launched Google Buzz in 2010, and it was a disaster, right? Like it came out and it like harvested. You couldn't really opt out. You were kind of like in no matter what. If you had a Gmail account or another Google account, you couldn't really get out. And then it also made all of your like most frequent contacts public by default. It was a total train wreck. And they pulled it back. And then of course, all the class action lawsuits came in from all the Gmail users. And then the EU got all uppity. And so it was just one of many. Google doesn't care. Whatever. It was a train wreck. Okay? But it was then the FTC right then said in their enforcement, their settlement, the enforcement action, which is sort of the same as a pronouncement, effectively, they were like, look, you need to have a comprehensive privacy program. You got to have privacy by design. You got to put all this into effect. And I think since then, and then of course they got in a lot of trouble a few years later because they changed the privacy policies all retroactively, which is another thing you really can't really do, but unless you're Google. But but to their credit, I mean, I think that they did really sort of embrace this notion of privacy engineering subsequently, and privacy engineering, or if you want to call it sort of security engineering to a certain extent, when you're working with security principles, really takes into account the fact that you have to look at this from at least three perspectives. You have to look at it from an engineering perspective. Whoever's doing, designing, working on the product themselves, you have to look at it from a legal perspective, what are the rules, but then you also have to have the user perspective, right? And if you don't have the user element, then you have two people, like a legal person and an engineer, and God love us, right? Like who knows what they, but you have to have somebody who's really in charge of like how people are using and what are the foreseeable potential uses, what are the things you hadn't thought about, and you put those things together, and it's a really, really important field, and especially because a lot of design is very subtle, right? Like so, I can, Snapchat gets you to do certain things, not based on anything in particular, but maybe it's where they put the banner on the person who's wearing the swimming suit on the, that sort of looks kind of sexy but isn't, and there's all kinds of, or they've done other studies where it's sort of like if you get a questionnaire from some, sort of hippie outfit that's like written in like, crazy font that looks like, got a marijuana leaf on it or whatever, and has, it looks like a total shaky thing, and asks you about your drug use habits, you give that to a group of people and you ask them to fill it out, and then you give another group of people like something from Bank of America, secure SSL up at the top, it's like, nice tight font and all that kind of stuff. People tell the truth on the other one, right? The one that can't be trusted, right? Like, because they go for it, right? They're feeling groovy. I mean, so there's all kinds of like design design implications that are not sort of straightforward and don't come straight out of the wall, straight out of the engineering. So I think that, it certainly is the law, right? It certainly is the law that you have to have, the FTC was clear and adamant about that early on, that you have to put this, and that would include your IoT devices, right? It has to be taken into account. What are the security implications? And again, a bad answer is better than no answer, a lot better than no answer. Obviously, it needs to be sort of, reasonably calculated, but the days of not paying attention and leaving things vulnerable, I think are definitely gone.
All right, anybody in the audience?
I'm just wondering if you guys sort of like thought about, or any ideas about sort of if there's a way to like legally attack from like the sort of rights perspective of people that don't want to be part of this, and like it's sort of monopolized, or like you can't have if you don't like have a cell phone, you can't like get a job, or like I can't pay my rent with cash anymore, which is weird, but like I have the money, but like they won't take it, but I have a bank account for it, and sort of like, so for people that like want to not be part of it and would say like no to like the cookies thing and no to all that, but like then aren't, is there some sort of like rights sort of thing around that, or is it just considered?
Well, the quick answer is that if you want to use the service, you still have to deal with the terms and requirements that I, who provide the service, are. Because you don't have to use Facebook, you don't have to use Twitter, you don't have to use Alexa, you don't have to use any of these things. And so the legal regime, I think, is very clear, is that we have no obligation to make it possible for you to do business outside of this scope.
Although I think the EU has a slightly different take on that. I think in the EU, especially like in a place like Germany, I think they would say you don't have an option to use Facebook. So Facebook, if you need to, the German regulators would say, you need to come up with an option that does not involve the sort of invasive collection of data. I think that but you're absolutely right. In the US, or we just won't give it to you. It's data driven, it's data paid. If you don't want to give up the data, then you can't. But then the IoT comes into play, and there you really have no control, right? Because there you're and that's where you get the surveillance. Remember I mentioned earlier surveillance and the consumer tort protections, or whatever. That's where you get the surveillance laws. Because I think people should be paying attention to the surveillance aspects of things. The City of London put up cameras all around the whole place, right? And that's something that was kind of odd for a European country to sanction, right? And the European Court of Justice struck it down. They're like, that's not, same thing as the problem with Snowden was like, that's not proportional, it's a necessity of proportionality, that's not proportional to the needs, right? Collecting data on absolutely everybody everywhere, that's a good idea.
Which is different than corporate surveillance. And I would argue corporate surveillance is even more intrusive than the government surveillance. Government's more